Good morning, sir. My name is Sir JL Corcega, and I'm about to discuss the physical science, the understanding of Newton's first law of motion. So, as we going through this module, learners are expected to state Newton's first law of motion. Number two, define what is inertia. Recognize the relationship of mass and inertia. Explain the subtle distinction between the Newton's first law of motion and Galileo's assertion that force is not necessary to sustain horizontal motion. And the last is apply Newton's first law to understand the effect of applying a force on an object. So first, the learners will have to answer what I know. So dito, magte-take sila ng pre-test from 1 to 15. So the following are the question. So expected answer nila. Ayan, one of my student answered the pre-test and he got the score of 15/15. So dito, itatalakay nila kung ano yung mga natutunan nila on the previous topics. Another one is, ayan, si Trisha May, one of my student. So, he got also perfect 15 score. So, the proper discussion, lesson 1. So, understanding Newton's first law of motion. So, here, nabigay na yung definition of inertia, which is the tendency of an object to resist change when in motion or when at rest. So, Newton's first law of motion is also called law of inertia. So, it states there that when it is at rest, it will continue to be at rest unless there is a force applied on it. To start, so makikita nila sa module yung what's in. So, to get started, you have to choose the terms related to motion from word pool. So, list down these words on the table and write what you know about. So, kukunin natin yung idea nila regarding dun sa mga word dun sa box. And then, they're going to define what they know about this word. So, nagbigay na ako ng sarili kong expectation from my student. First, energy. So, the strength of vitality required for sustained physical or mental activity. Next is mass, gravity, velocity. And that is some of my expectation with my learners. And here's one of my students sent it to me. Her answer: the energy, potential, mass, kinetic, velocity, and friction. Next is another activity. So this is a bowling game. A heavy ball is rolled down a narrow lane aiming the pins. So what makes the ball keep rolling? So here, kukunin nila yung idea kung paano yung a scenario of a bowling game with the guided questions. Ito yun, what keeps an object at rest and what keeps it moving? What caused the object change in motion? How does an object's mass affect its inertia? So answer may vary, but some of its students, ito yung mga sagot nila. So when you roll a ball, so ito yung mga sample answer na binigay nila sa akin. Another one, so 10-pin bowling is a type of bowling which So the objective is to knock down all the pins. Ayan. So napaliwanag naman nila regarding dun sa pagkakaunawa nila kung paano nagko-continue na mag-roll yung bowling ball and paano siya nagkakamero ng pagtigil. Another one, ito na yung proper discussion ng topic namin. The definition of first law of motion. So, pinakilala muna dito si Galilei. So, Galileo and inertia. So Galileo developed the first concept of law of motion. So among these are the following. Develop the concept of motion in terms of velocity, that is speed and direction, by using the inclined planes. So develop the idea of force that causes motion. Determine that the natural state of an object is rest or uniform motion. So develop the idea that objects resist motion, that is inertia. So I have here an example of video na mapapanood ng mga learners natin regarding dun sa the concept of idea of Galilei on first law of motion. So ito yung makikita nila.
Galileo played with balls rolling down and then up ramps at various angles. He found that a ball rolling down a ramp and then up an identical ramp came to the same height. If the upward ramp were less steep, he found the ball wouldn't slow down as quickly, which meant it could travel for a longer time. It would then end up at the same height at which it was released. In all cases, he found that the height of the final position matched that of the initial position, which made him wonder, if the final ramp were flat, in that case the ball would never lose speed. Or rather, it would maintain its speed, but for how long? Upon thinking about this, Galileo concluded it would maintain its speed indefinitely. In the absence of any retarding forces, the ball has a tendency to move forever without slowing down. Today, we call this property of an object to resist changes in its motion inertia.
Okay, with the help of presentation this video to the learners, so makukuha nila yung idea dun sa first law of motion ni Galileo Galilei. So to summarize, so according to Galileo, so objects in motion eventually stop because of force called friction. So it is a force that opposes motion between any surfaces that are touching. So this is based on his experiments observed. So pinaliwanag din sa video. So he said that a difference between initial and final height was due to the presence of friction. So kung merong incline na surface from the height, pag binitiwan mo, diretso pa rin siya. So maaabot niya yung same height. So he concluded that if friction could be entirely eliminated, so the ball would reach exactly the same height. Or if the ball rolls horizontally and there's no friction that acts on it, the ball will never stop. So yun yung explanation summary with regards to Galileo's concept of first law of motion. Next is Sir Isaac Newton and his first law of motion. So dito, inintroduce na yung si Sir Isaac Newton, and with the help of concept of Galileo Galilei, nag-formulate dito si Sir Isaac Newton yung kanyang first law of motion. So he stated there that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by unbalanced force. Okay, let's talk about the mass and inertia. An object's inertia depends on its mass. So mass is the amount of matter or substance that makes up an object. It is measured in units called kilogram. An object with a greater mass has a greater inertia. So therefore, an object with a lesser mass will also have a lesser inertia. So I have here an example, wooden box and styrofoam. So here, Which do you think has a greater mass or lesser, which has a greater inertia? So, makikita natin dun sa ating sa concept nitong idea nito na mass and inertia, the learners or our grade 11 student will have answer. Sino kaya dito mas may greater mass? According to sa picture, makikita natin wooden box and styrofoam. So, as we understand this sentence, mas mabigat si wooden box compared to styrofoam. So therefore, box with a greater mass also have greater inertia. While the styrofoam box, makakompare natin siya, magaan siya. So therefore, it has a lesser inertia. So exploring inertia, we have three types. The inertia of rest. For example of this is a plate on a table. Now, by the definition, an object will stay in place unless something or somebody moves it. Another inertia is inertia of motion. An object will continue at the same speed until a force acts on it. Another example is a rolling ball. And the last type of inertia is inertia of direction. So an object will stay moving in the same direction unless force acts on it. Example is a moving car turning right. So I have here another video with regards to Newton's first law of motion.
Imagine you're sitting on a recliner chair watching your favorite movie on a lazy Sunday. And your mom calls out your name and asks you to run some errands. You can imagine how difficult it would be for you to get up and do the work. Imagine you're practicing for your 100 meters race on this track, and somebody asks you to stop immediately within a second. Will you be able to do it? What if you're suddenly asked to turn towards the right? Will you be able to turn immediately? The answer to both the questions would be a no. You can stop, yes, but gradually. You can also turn, but not sharply. And guess what? It's the same story with every object. Every object will continue to do what it's doing. If it's at rest, it will remain at rest. And if it's in motion, it will stay in motion. But what can change this? Yes, only an unbalanced force can change this. If it's at rest and an unbalanced force acts on it, it will move. If it's in constant motion and an unbalanced force acts on it, it may accelerate or change direction. And this is nothing but the Newton's first law of motion. Here's the correct definition. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. In simple words, it means that the objects continue to do what they're doing unless some external unbalanced force acts on them. We can also understand this using a simple diagram. If the forces are balanced, there can be two cases. An object may be at rest, or an object will be in motion at a non-zero constant velocity in a particular direction. These can be the only two cases when the forces are balanced. In the first case, the object will continue to remain at rest, and in the second, the object will continue to stay in motion at the same velocity and in the same direction. Don't forget, these two cases will remain true only if the forces are balanced. In the next video, we will look at a few applications of the first law of motion.
Okay, with the help of this video, so maintindihan ng mga estudyante or our learners with regards to the concept of idea of Newton's first law of motion. So dito na-introduce na yung forces of balance. So something, if an object at rest, so it stays at rest unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. So doon lang nagkakameron na acceleration. So dito na-introduce na yung forces. By the definition of forces according to Sir Isaac Newton, so what causes of an object to move, to stop or remain at rest? A forces causes an object to move, to stop or remain at rest. First, force is defined as push or pull. Push or pull. Newton is the unit of force, and 1 Newton is the amount of force required to give a 1 kilo mass an acceleration of 1 meters squared. Thus, the following unit equivalent can be stated as, yan, 1 Newton is equal to 1 kilogram times 1 meter squared. So, friction, if we're going to compare on the idea of Galileo Galilei, so he hypothesized that if the ball roll horizontally, kung dire-diretso siya in a flat surface, and there's no friction, the ball will never stop. That is according to Galileo Galilei. However, in this idea of Newton's first law of motion, he explained there that it does not stop because of absence of force. It is stopped because of the presence of cold friction. So mas detailed niya yung detalyado yung explanation dun sa friction, which came from the idea of Galileo Galilei. Here, pinaliwanag dito that friction is a force that opposes motion between any surface that are touching. Friction occurs because no surface is perfectly smooth. So rough surfaces have more friction than smooth surfaces. So heavier objects also have more friction because they are pressed harder with a greater force than lighter objects. Friction produces heat because it causes the molecules on rubbing surfaces to move faster and have more energy. So ito nga yung first law of motion ni Newton's. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object motion stays in motion, which with the same speed in the same direction unless acted upon by unbalanced force. Let's talk about the balance and unbalanced force. So a balanced force is force in which the net force is equal to 0. No acceleration, nag-stay lang siya sa isang stationary place. So what is a net force? A net force is the total combination of forces an opposite direction or the same direction acting on an object. So let's consider the free body diagram of a flower vase on the table. So there are two forces acting on the flower vase. The forces of table pushing the flower vase upward are called normal force, and the gravitational force pushing the flower vase downward. Yan. So pinaliwanag dito, equivalent lang yung forces from upwards and downwards. So therefore, it stays on the same place. So therefore, the forces between the two are balanced. Since the two forces are equal, so they have a balance forces to each other. And the net force is 0. So what is unbalanced force? So unbalanced force is a force in which the net force is greater than 0. So, may mga instances kung bakit nagkakameron ng unbalanced forces. For example, the force produced by the right team is greater than the left team by 10 Newton's power o Newton's unit, tipping the rope to the right direction. Since mas malakas yung force na nakukuha dun sa right side, so therefore, mapupul yung tali dun sa greater force. Another is kung if you're holding your dog, ayan, and something na mas malakas yung aso sa iyo, so mahihila ka niya. So therefore, it has a greater force. So nagkakameron tayo ng unbalanced force. So what's more? So in here, activity 2, sa learner, we have to understand on the different types of inertia. So they're going to analyze, to answer, diba we have 3 types of inertia. So they're going to explain each. Ano ba yung may apply natin dito? So from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ito yung expectation na makukuha kong answers from our learners. 1 explains the inertia of rest. Number 2, inertia of motion, inertia of direction, inertia of motion, and the last one is inertia of direction. So, kung mababalikan lang ng mga learners, so ito yung explanation or definition ng 3 types of inertia. Another is what I have learned. So dito ma-apply na natin ano ba yung mga natutunan ng mga estudyante with regards dun sa module na binigay natin. So they have to answer the question. So number 1, state Newton's first law of motion. What makes an object remain in state of motion or at rest? So they have to explain why. And number 2, explain the difference of Galileo's idea of inertia and Newton's first law of motion. So they have to answer ano ba yung difference between the two concept of first law of motion. Paano na iba with regards from the idea of Galileo's into what we are using right now, the Newton's first law of motion. So answer may vary. So here's an example na binigay sa akin ng mga estudyante ko. So I asked them na baka bigyan nila ako ng kopya for the documentation purposes, and they gave it to me. Ito yung mga sagot nila. So one of them answer, Newton's first law of motion states that a body of rest remains at rest. Ayun nga, this is also known as the law of inertia. Inertia is tendency of an object to remain at rest or remain in motion. So Galileo's, ito yung difference between the two, the Galileo's and Newton's. So inertia is the resistance of any physical object to any change. So this includes changes to the object's speed, ganun. However, Newton's focuses on how object move. So nandito na yung inertia, resisting of moving, and how things move. So perfect, maganda yung pagkakasagot ng bata. Another one is, let's focus na lang tayo sa number 2. Inertia refers to the tendency of any material to change in state of motion. Galileo asserted that if rolling ball was left alone, it will continue to move. So yun nga yung naging problema with regards to sa hypothesis about friction ni Galileo Galilei. So if we going to roll the ball on horizontal, it will never stop. However, by the definition of Newton's first law, yung friction na sinasabi ni Galileo Galilei, hindi siya titigil. But if there's a rough surface, yung forces na titigil sa kanya is automatic, yung friction mismo. Why? So yung friction na tinutukoy natin, siya yung something that touches the ball, tumitigil siya. Ayan. And that is the idea of Newton's law of motion, unless acted upon by unbalanced force, and that is friction. So perfect, maganda po yung pagkakasagot ng mga bata. So here's another example. Yan, hindi ko na po yung mapapaliwanag. Bago ko pa naman pinost dito, inanalyze ko din yung ininawawa ko din yung mga sagot nila. Magaganda naman po yung mga binigay nila sa aking mga sagot. So what I can do here, we focus on the application. So create an acrostic poem. Now that you have understand the law of inertia, create an acrostic poem using the word inertia. So dito, wala lang, they have to share their idea with experiencing COVID-19 pandemic in poem. So if we're going to check dun sa WHLP, hindi ko na siya isinama since medyo mahihirapan yung estudyante. But I have prepared my answer. So this would be some of example. So this one, ginawa ko na siya, no, explanation with regards dun sa COVID pandemic. And luckily, so one of my student sent it to me. So which is something na nakakatuwa, na sinagutan pa rin nila despite na hindi ko na nga siya isinama. So ito yung isa sa mga sagot. Individuality earns awareness through nourishing its values of economy, presence in health, right in creating diversity, to life of people, in initiating caring for environment, health, and accommodate future. Which is nakakatuwa para dun sa bata na binigay pa rin niya yung idea niya with regards dun sa creating a poem. So maganda po yung pagkakagawa ng bata. So on the last part, no, meron tayong tinatawag na assessment, which is the post-assessment. So they have to write true or false, or you have to modify ano ba yung sentence, which word that makes correct, which makes correct and which make wrong, which makes wrong. So from 1 to 15, so yan, my students answered perfectly, and another is 15 also. So maganda pa yung pagkakasagot nila, no? And the last part, yan, additional activities para dun sa mga learners na hindi nakaka-catch up on time, so or something dun sa mga estudyante na need for remedial. So they're going to have explanation, no? So they're going to recognize inertia. So mag-create sila at least 5 activities you do every day. You might be surprised at how much moment of inertia you have in your life. So madali lang to ako para sa kanila, para dun sa mga batang hindi nakapag-catch up on time. So reflections. So here's my reflection. Some of my students were not able to access the internet. Some of them they have no gadget, which can be a problem to catch up with the discussion. Hindi lang sila pwede mag-rely on module. However, since science is something that is complicated, so they need additional references. So if they're going to have access to the internet, so nagiging mas madali yung discussion. So another reflection, if they're going to have an access to YouTube, so nagiging mas madali yung topic. Nagiging mas mukha siyang madali pagka kumuha din sila ng idea with other references. Hindi lang sila nagre-rely on one reference, which is the module. So overall expectation to the learners. So at least since we have nasa week 6 pa lang kami, no, so ibibigay pa lang nila sa akin yung outputs nila this week. So my expectation at least 93%, mataas na yun. Or 48 out of 52 were able to understand the topics. So only few or 2% cases of student will need assistance when it comes to follow the given task on time. Here are some of my students who need more time to finish their output. Kasi yung iba talaga, late pa rin po sila makapag-submit ng output nila. So therefore, I have to give them more time para ma-accomplish nila yon. So ito yung mga conversation with them. So they promise na, sir, magsasubmit pa rin po ako. Okay, thank you po, sir. Maraming salamat po at natapos niyo po itong video to, no? So ito po yung naging flow ng discussion o topic dun sa module na binigay natin po sa mga bata. And natutuwa po ko and some of them talagang nagbigay ng effort with regards to answering the questions. Some of them talagang they give extra dun sa mga hindi ko naman ibinigay na task. Talagang sinagutan pa rin nila, which is something good para dun sa bata na uunawaan nila yung discussion. Again, sir, maraming salamat po. Thank you po dun sa pakikinig at pag-unawa po dun sa mga background na narinig natin. Maraming salamat po, sir. God bless po.